actually go ahead and do that now. And we'll go ahead and get started. So welcome everybody. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Christy Walkuski. I'm the director of the Brain Center for Community Engagement here at BW. Julie Robinson is also here, and you'll hear more from her in just a bit. I see many familiar names and faces here logged in. So as many of you know, this is our fourth and final session in our fall series for the Civic LEAD Series. You can find recordings for all of our previous fall sessions, as well as our summer series at the event page, which is bw.edu/civic. In addition to the recordings of all of those sessions, you can also find a number of resources that were recommended by each of our presenters. So the Civic LEAD series was created in the wake of a disturbing summer of violence and police brutality, which sparked renewed momentum for the ongoing movement for racial justice in this country. And we've seen ripples of this here in our own community at BW as well, including today's session is being co-hosted with student leaders from one of our new and kind of in development student organizations called Unite for Justice. This organization is led by Kiera Hansberry and Nick Galeta, who are both here with us today. If you're interested in getting more information about how you can get involved with Unite for Justice, just stick around after the session and any of them or myself would be happy to connect you. Additionally, we are in the process of exploring new topics and potential speakers for our spring series. So if you have ideas of a topic you'd like to see us explore or a story of your own to share, please do reach out to us. We would love to have you involved in the planning for that. A little bit of virtual event etiquette. Everyone will remain muted, but we encourage questions. So if you've got questions or clarifications you'd like to ask for Kysten, you can put them in the chat box, and we'll leave some time at the end for conversation as well. And as I mentioned already, this session is being recorded and will be shared to our Brain Center YouTube channel. And finally, this event, like all of our events, are rooted in the expectations established by BW's Community Standards of Conduct. So we expect this to be a space where we can engage empathetically, respectfully, and thoughtfully together. So with all those logistics out of the way, I'm thrilled to welcome our team here today. Kysten and the BW community, we connected last semester over the summer around one of our weekly programs that we run with one of the juvenile facilities here in Cleveland. And Kysten's become a great friend to the Brain Center since then. We've had many conversations and we're thrilled to have her here today. Kysten was the reentry coordinator for the Franklin County Office of Justice Policy and Programs for over a decade before accepting her current role with the Ohio Department of Youth Services as the Deputy Director of Community Engagement and Reentry. In addition to this work, her resume is long and broad, from researcher to teaching in social welfare policy and programs, serving as the president of the Ohio Justice Alliance for Community Corrections. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts in Criminal Justice from Capital University, a Juris Doctorate, a Master's in Social Work Administration, and a Master's in Public Policy and Management from Ohio State. And is also a recent graduate of the National Association of Counties High Performance Leadership Academy. And her bio goes on and on. So I encourage you to read that if you haven't seen that in your information about this event. Joining Kysten Palmore today will be Nick Galeta, who's a senior here studying psychology and sociology and one of the co-founders of Unite for Justice. So Nick will be helping to facilitate our conversation today. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over.
Well, thanks for the great intro, Christy, and taking care about. Thanks for being here today. I know we only have about an hour for this event, a little bit less now after going over the ground rules. So I know you could probably fill us a whole semester with a lot of this information. So I guess we'll just jump into the topic here. So everyone can get to know a little bit more about you. Can you discuss your current role with the Ohio Department of Youth Services and some of the previous work that you've done with reentry in the state of Ohio?
Sure. So primarily what the community engagement and reentry department does is it works with the youth and case managers in the community and inside of the institution to make sure that the youth are prepared to come home to the community. We really stress community engagement. with our youth, like services coming back into the facility with the advent or the COVID. We haven't been able to really engage as much as we would like to. But one of the things that we are doing is to ensure that when things go back to normal, if you will, that we are working with community providers, service providers, to ensure that we have meaningful activities for the youth. So that's my role. And I used to do that for Franklin County, but I did it on the adult system. So I was working with the legislatures, and I still work with some of the legislators, not as much because my role now is more on a state level. And when I was working for Franklin County, of course, it was on a county level and more grassroots.
So you said now your role is more on a state level. Can you also provide a little bit of background on the juvenile correction system in Ohio, maybe like the number of facilities and some of the ways that the youth end up getting involved with the work that you do? What brings them to you?
Sure. So we have 3 facilities. We have one in Circleville, Indian River, which is up in Massillon in the Cuyahoga Hills. And we have 4 alternative placement facilities where girls are housed. We're legally able to house youth from the age of 10 to 21. At the age of 21, they have to be released. And currently we have a youth as young as 11. Our current daily average population is approximately 300. The majority of our youth in our facilities are 17, and the average age of release is 18.3, and our length of stay is usually legally from 6 months to 12 months, but we're seeing slightly longer stays. Recently, our average length of stay is 17.2 months. Our composition, if you will, is 15.9, almost nearly 60% Black male youths, and 93% males and 7% females. And we have 47.7% of the population in DYS are crimes against person. That includes property, sexual offenses, homicide, drug offenses, and other. And 66% of our population is receiving some type of mental health treatment, and 100% of our females that are in our alternative placement, they're receiving mental health treatment. And so when you get into the contributing factors of this, we're looking at absent parents, family members in prison, struggles in schools, influences by gangs, impacted by trauma, and having children at a young age, housing instability, low-income homes, substance use or abuse. And DYS, our youth at DYS are among the highest need and most at risk in Ohio. And our goal is to serve youth holistically, working with families throughout the youth incarceration and parole. So we don't get youth for curfew or truancy. Youth, that track goes to your local detention facilities or detention centers. The youth that we get are once among the highest, as I said, the highest risk, and they have committed crimes, not status offenses. Usually when you have truancy and curfews, those are status offenses, and they go to your local juvenile detention facilities.
So can you expand a little bit on what exactly, what types of crimes then would get sent to you?
So we have murder, assault, rape, drug offenses, either possession or possession with the intent to sell, property damage, robbery, burglary, those types of things.
So a wide range of things that you're dealing with. I want to go back to something that you said here. You said that in your population, it's roughly 60% male youth, are 60% African-American male youth in your population. Of course, the general population is 60% African American, and you mentioned some of these contributing factors: poverty, gang trauma, things along that nature. Can you speak a little bit? Maybe I'm making an assumption here that some of those contributing factors are affecting those groups of individuals disproportionately, and that's why you're ending up with close to 60% of that demographic in your population?
Oh, absolutely. So when you're looking at, we look at protective factors. Those are the things that that you usually look at. Intact families, economically mobile, high performing schools, safe neighborhoods, access to mental health, physical health care. Those are a buffer. And when you're dealing with underserved, traditionally underserved or impoverished communities, those have a contributing factor in finding ways into the criminal justice system. And when you talked about the intersectionality between race, poverty, and the criminal justice system, then you hit on all three of those. When you look at the historical factors of economically depressed, and we're looking right now with COVID, we're dealing with housing instability, loss of jobs. And when we are talking about most of the folks that are who have lost their jobs are individuals who had low wage, low paying, or day labor, where individuals would have to show up or they don't get paid. And when those close, then you're looking at an opportunity for further, I would say, a further decline in economic mobility.
I want to ask now, because you mentioned buffers, and a lot of what you're mentioning, these are societal influences that seem to be contributing to criminal behavior that is happening amongst the populations that you're dealing with. There's kind of two schools of thought on criminal behavior, if you want to say criminals, or how people end up committing certain behaviors and not others. One being this idea of it's more psychological, human agency, rational decision making, that the individual is responsible for essentially what happens to them, what they choose to do. The other emphasizing very strongly social structures, institutions, a lot of the things that you mentioned as contributing factors to how people end up getting involved in the criminal justice system and related aspects of that as well. Can you speak from your knowledge and your experiences a little bit, how much of crime, of criminal behavior is attributable to more of a psychological individual explanation versus our systems, our institutions, a sociological explanation?
I don't think it's a question of either or. It's a question of, like, as I mentioned, contributing factors. Not all individuals who suffer from mental illness or have a cognitive impairment commit crimes. We also know that not all individuals that come from impoverished and substantially underserved communities commit crime. However, the presence of one or both are most definitely contributing factors. But we also have to understand that, again, when you have protective factors, the likelihood that you find your trajectory into a criminal justice system is high. So when you have, and let me make sure I said that. So when you do not have protective factors, the likelihood that your trajectory into the criminal justice system is higher. There's a higher probability. When those protective factors are there, when you have community, and then in your family, and I don't mean your biological family, I mean your extended family or your community family, when you have some of those protective factors in that way, someone who cares about you, someone who's making sure that you have access and are going to your mental health appointments, being diagnosed with their mental health issues. Some of these young folks in the criminal justice system, in the juvenile justice system, I should say, have never been diagnosed with a mental illness. And they may have, of course, as we know, that sometimes depending on the particular mental illness, that we have a family history of mental illness that has never been diagnosed. And so you couple with that with substance use, because you are self-medicating, and then you have really a powder keg, which means that likelihood, if you have a substance abuse, you're stealing to keep your habit up, and then you spiral down. So these protective factors really will keep individuals from coming into the criminal justice system. And when we're dealing with youth, for the youth, law has not, in some jurisdictions, in some courts, they have not acknowledged brain science as mitigating factors to culpability. And for adults, the Supreme Court in 2002, now we're talking in 2002, ruled 6-3 that executing people with intellectual disability violates the Eighth Amendment ban on cruel and unusual punishment. But it is left to the states to define what an intellectual disability is. And so when you're looking at youth, we're talking about brain development. And so we know that the prefrontal cortex occurs primarily during adolescence and is not fully developed until the age of 25. And so the development of the prefrontal cortex is very important for behavior performances, such as regions of the brains that help accomplish executive brain functions. And those brain functions help, anticipation, judgment, planning, decision-making. And the executive brain functions are talking about, adaptability, thinking, self-monitoring, self-control. And a lot of our youth have the inability to self-regulate their behavior. And it's because of the fact that they have not had, prior to coming into our facilities, they have not had the access to the mental health, or even to opportunities to get an individual education plan if they have some cognitive deficits.
I just want to make a comment really quick. I got kicked off of my internet, so I had to jump into Christy's seat. That's why it says that I'm Christy Walkuski.
No problem.
But I heard most of what you said, and on your last point, they're talking about the natural development of the life course, and I studied neuroscience for a while, and so when you're speaking about this idea of a prefrontal cortex not being fully formed, things like executive functioning being impaired just because of the age, when people that are thought of, I think there's a common misconception in society that when people are trying to re-enter society, that it's always violent offenders, that somehow the average citizen is being put at increased risk because we are being quote unquote empathetic or showing sympathy to these types of people. Can you talk a little bit about what is that maturation process? What does it look like in your facilities? And then when people are being, when they're trying to be re-entered into society, how should society assist them, or how should they feel when that's going on?
Okay, so this is where I put in my big disclaimer. So the views and opinions that are being expressed from this point are not reflective or representative of the ways in any way the views or opinions of the state of Ohio in general, or the Ohio Department of Youth Service in particular. These are Kysten Palmore's views and not reflective of my organization. So one of the things is a huge contributing factor to how society views individuals coming in from incarceration, whether they're youth or they're adults. It's the media, the fear mongering, the language that we use, convict, ex-offender, offender, and we always get the sensationalized journalism, right? And they do a great job of othering. And one of the issues that we have to deal with, and specifically when we're dealing with our youth, is that we have to get our communities to understand that these youth are youth. I mean, they are kids. They are just like your nieces and your nephews. They're still kids. They need love. They need attention, and they need to know that someone cares about them, someone believes in them, and someone is going to protect them. And when they say, and it's true, and I know that people think that it's a cliche, but hurt people, right? And when you're looking at the number of women, young folks who come into the justice system. Like we're talking about girls. Sexual abuse is a primary predictor of justice involvement in girls. So the connection between sexual violence in girls and the ultimate incarceration is not coincidental. It's a direct contributing factor. And so we always report on the recidivism. We never report on the causes of recidivism. We never talk about the poor schoolings, the poor funding for schools, the poor school systems. We never talk about housing and the lack thereof, homelessness. And each and every time a family has to move from one school district to another, a child loses at least 2 to 3 days, sometimes a week. And we know that if a child misses 2 to 3 days a month, we are looking at a likelihood that our child will not graduate from high school. And we don't put in enough emphasis on really finding mental health counselors inside of schools. We have militarized our schools with police officers in our school. The fact that we call these individuals who are in our schools resource officers. If that was true, then we would not have a school to prison pipeline. And we need to really make our resource officers be a resource, and that they should not be the way in which the avenue for individuals to come into our juvenile correctional facility. And we never see the media report on successes. You never ever see John Brown got a job today. John Brown was, and unless of course there's some really, really heinous event that causes someone to go back into the system, such as the example of Brian Goolsby, who abducted Reagan Tokes. He abducted and murdered Reagan Tokes, who was a OSU student who was 21, and she was coming home from work when he abducted her and made her go to several ATMs and then murder her in her car. We never ever do a study, and I don't want to call it a morbidity study, but that's what happens in hospitals when individuals die. They do a morbidity study. We never do a wholesale systemic evaluation of the system. We always go to an individual failing. It was the individual's fault. And why? We never ever look at the systems that failed the individuals. And if you ever have an opportunity to look at Brian Goolsby's transcript, you will see that the system failed him from the time he was born until the time he recommitted the act of murdering. Recommitted to the prison by the act of murdering Reagan Tokes. And so we also have to look at our society and what we view as how we right a wrong. When an individual has violated a crime, we feel that they have broken a social contract, and that is that contract that you will follow X, Y, Z. And so we have a history and a Judeo-Christian concept of retribution, punishment, and revenge. And we also have dichotomous concepts of types of people: good versus bad, evil versus holy. More recently, we have the deserving and the undeserving. We have the deserving of the opiate epidemic and the undeserving of the crack cocaine. In the 1930s, we had the heroin addiction, and in the 1970s, when individuals were coming back from Vietnam, heroin addiction. And what we have done is that all of a sudden we decided that it's now a disease, but addiction has always been the disease, no matter the drug or the people who suffer from it. So this is a system that we as a society have built, and now we have to live with the repercussions. So the US makes up 5% of the world's population, but we incarcerate 25% of our nation's inhabitants. And for individuals who are going into incarceration, and we're talking about adults, 97% of all prisoners will return to the community. 97, only 3% are either are serving a lifetime sentence or will be executed. So it is incumbent upon our society to create opportunities for success. Failure to do so will result in additional costs to the community and society. That's the creation of more victims, pain and suffering for families of victims, and our priorities are backwards. How we raise and spend money reflects what we value, and our leaders say that we want all children to have access to good schools. They want to help working people get ahead. They want to provide treatment for people struggling with mental illness and addiction. And most of the Buckeyes in this state also want these things too, but without sufficient state support, we'll never achieve our goals. And for example, at the beginning of the COVID crisis, our state budget was reduced due to the failure of the falling revenues, and the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction was the only state agency that did not receive a budget cut. And it was the third highest funded agency among all Ohio agencies in our 88 counties. Medicaid spending was cut, K-12 foundation payments were cut, Ohio other educational budgets were cut, higher education was cut, and other safety nets. Other agencies that provide safety nets were also cut. So,
and I want to ask, because you mentioned the state budget there at the end. In 2018, for example, like we're talking a little bit here about how maybe race and poverty intersect, and then of course the criminal justice system. Looking at the budget, Ohio State, the university, was given almost $400 million subsidized by the state, more than every community college in the state combined. And again, when we're looking at things like that, my question for you is, if we're trying to effectuate change, you keep mentioning that our priorities are out of order, that we've made this mess, that we have to live with it, or that we have to realign it to what we want it to be. What level of government is the most effective? If we're going to fight public policy, is it at the federal level? Is it at the state level? Is it in local elections? Can you expand your thoughts a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, first, in the reentry world and in a policy world, we always say all politics are local, but that doesn't mean that federal government in your state government is not as equally important. But you can effectuate change because there are things that are happening in people's communities and counties and cities that don't necessarily reflect what is happening across the nation or in your state. So I would say that you start at the local level, you start at the grassroots level, and then you work your way up. But when you're looking at federal is important because you need to understand that what is happening with the Supreme Court. That can happen on a local level unless you're talking about your state Supreme Court. But we have an election here, and so voting down ballot is just as important as voting up ballot. So I want to press upon that. So knowing your judges and your sheriffs and your prosecutors as well, because if you want to have restorative justice, prosecutors are very, very instrumental in making sure that you have restorative justice. If you're looking for diversion opportunities, prosecutors control that as well.
Thanks, Kysten. We have a question from the chat that I think is kind of timely with what you were just talking about with restorative justice a little bit. And the question is, how many young people return to the criminal justice system after release? In other words, what is the recidivism rate? And maybe it's different if people have gone into diversion programs. I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Well, we have a recidivism rate is like, and I always like to talk about how many people do not return. So in that sense, we're looking at roughly 60.5% of juveniles do not return to the juvenile system. So if you want to flip that on your head, we have a recidivism rate of 40% roughly. give or take. And one of the things that you have to take into account is that we take individuals out of communities that are underserved, underutilized, that have divestment, that have been ravaged, and then we put them in the juvenile correctional facilities. We work on them as far as working with them as far as getting their mental health needs met, education needs met, and then we plop them, and then working on resisting gang, and then we plop them right back in the community in which they came from, because we're dealing with juveniles, and so they go home. And it's highly unlikely, unless of course we have individuals who age out at the age of 21 that don't go home, and even those young folks go home. So we're dealing with factors that we have to have two systems working at parallel efforts. One to rehabilitate, and we say for youth rehabilitate, because rehabilitation implies that they knew better, and now we're working on it. And some of the systems that in areas that our youth come from, you don't know what you don't know, and you can't be what you haven't seen. And so in order for those things to happen, we bring in folks from the community to talk about opportunities for success. And they see judges and lawyers, and not in the way in which they stand in front of them to be judged, but they also have an opportunity to talk to them. We bring in opportunities for them to be able to see other opportunities and other ways to be successful when they reintegrate into the community. But that doesn't mean that peer association and peer groups are very strong influences. And it doesn't mean if there are no opportunities that are being opened up, and especially and now where we're seeing a lot of our social service agencies, nonprofit agencies may not survive the next 3 years or 5 years or even a year. It puts a lot of strain on our communities to try to lift up these young people to make sure that they are successful.
So on that note, like you've mentioned, restorative justice, we've talked about rehabilitation, a lot of these words that sometimes get thrown around to the point of being buzzwords, to the point that, like, a lot of people will maybe put them into this camp of like, oh, you're so social justice-y, or you're all about, helping someone that's put themselves in one of these poor situations with their own individual conduct. But can you speak to why it matters, why is it worthwhile that we continue to try to rehabilitate people, even if it's not 100% a success rate? What costs to society are there when we don't rehabilitate people?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, when we don't work successfully to reintegrate individuals into our society, hurt people, right? So when we have folks who are desperate and have not really been able to work on, for you and I, we have protective factors. We don't have criminogenic thinking, like we have pro-social thinking. So if we would lose a job, we have a network, right? We could go to our network and we can begin to having conversations and begin networking and meeting people that know people who could bring us in to a fold. And we think in terms of what do I know or what can I do in a pro-social way to feed my family and make sure that I am I'm okay, for lack of a better term. But for individuals who do not have those, I mean, if you've all you know are people who have had a history of being in and out of the correctional facilities, they don't have people to support them. I mean, a good support system is worth its weight in gold when you're talking about being able to maneuver and navigate through the community and get yourself in a situation to be successful. So we're looking at additional victims. The cost to the police, the cost to jails. You have to feed and clothe and provide medical attention to individuals who are in jail, who are in juvenile detention, who are in prison. You have parole, you have probation, you have pretrial services costs, you have courts, you have prosecutor, court stenographer, jails, bailiff, court security, defense attorneys, public defenders, cost of prisons, correctional officers, healthcare, behavioral health, food, programming, and the cost to individuals and individual families. So what we say when we're talking about individuals who are incarcerated, that it's not just the individual who is being incarcerated, it is also their families who serve time as well. If you are incarcerating the head of the household, be it male or female, that's a loss of income. And now you have to figure out, how do we survive and how do we make ends meet? And then you have to worry about generational cycles of incarceration, right? So if I don't have a strong family connection or a strong family bond, be it biological or community, to make sure that that is not the way in which I follow, the path that I follow, then that is a vicious cycle over and over and over again. And one of the things that we have to do is that, when we have ballots, when we have opportunity, if we say that we want to, because I think our society thinks in a more reactionary instead of a more proactive education, healthcare, making sure that the money, when we're talking about opportunity zones in these divested and disinvestment communities, that the money that we're talking about for economic mobility in these communities are going to those communities and not to developers who come in and take the money and never really truly invest in the community. We have to build strong foundations, and we have to stop othering, and we have to talk about systemic racism, de jure and de facto. And we have to have uncomfortable conversations.
Okay, so you gave us a long list of the cost to society, and it sounds like that vicious cycle is not just one that the individual gets wrapped up in. It sounds like society is right there with them, dealing with a lot of those consequences, and of course the cost to taxpayers' dollars. We have a question from the chat that touches on one of these issues. It says, one of the policies I find counterintuitive is how having a felony on your record can restrict employment opportunities. Is there a movement to eliminate, or modify this policy? Additionally, in some industries where they cannot meet hiring demands due to lack of people that have those particular skills, what kind of programs exist for youth that might provide an opportunity to fill those opportunities, if there are any?
So unfortunately, we have focused a lot on the adult system, where for Ohio, in Ohio, there are 700 collateral sanctions. And a collateral sanction is a civil matter that says because you committed XYZ offense, you are prohibited from entering into particular industries. Now, the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity, in 2016, I believe, don't quote me on the date, presented guidelines that said that it was based on the crime that was committed, the extent, how far away the crime was, and how long ago the crime was committed, what a person has done recently, and whether or not the offense that a person's committed is directly related to the job that they would be doing, or the things or the factors or the guidelines that you should use to measure whether or not a person should be hired. And those were the EEOC guidelines, but they also couched it in the fact that the number of people who were being denied employment because of the fact that there was a disproportionate number of individuals of color, particularly African American or Black, who were incarcerated were disproportionately affected by the denial of employment. And so this is one way in which the EEOC said that they could use the EEOC as a bulwark to help individuals get into employment. But that should be used across the board for youth as well when we're talking about employment opportunities. And then there are, in Ohio, we have what is called the CQE, which is the Certificate of Qualification for Employment, which allows an individual employer to hire, if they have this certificate, which is awarded by a judge, a local judge, not necessarily the sentencing judge, but a local judge in the common pleas. They sign off on it after being reviewed by the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Corrections and said, yes, this person has been rehabilitated, and yes, they are a contributing member of society, are no longer a threat to the community. And this certificate allows this individual to be hired. Well, the employer hires the person, and what this certificate does, it shields the individual employer from being charged with a negligent hiring. So it shields the employer, provides immunity for prosecution for negligent hiring. So insurance companies are always saying, well, we can't hire because their insurance policy would go up because of the negligent hiring, because of hiring an individual who has a felony, and so we can't hire this person. But the CQE allows an individual, you can get that for people who can't get their records expunged because of a felony. So you have records expungement and sealing. Only a juvenile is eligible for expungement, and adults get their records sealed. And juveniles are only eligible for expungement 5 years after they have been released from a juvenile facility and off parole. So if a juvenile has a felony, it's far more likely that they are going to be in DYS, and that means that they have to wait 5 years. So I am working with the legislative liaisons in my office, DYS, as well as the Ohio Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, and then some legislators to allow the CQE to be afforded to the youth. It's a heavy lift, especially during COVID in legislature. We're not really looking at revising some of the legislation they've already done. They're looking for new legislation. So if we can get an opportunity to open up the legislation for the CQE as well as the expungement, then we may be able to add that language in. That was a long-winded, but I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it's a good question, and appreciate you giving such a detailed answer to that. We have another pretty good question in the chat here. Is the state of Ohio working at all with the Charles Koch Institute? I believe they are supporting efforts to help convicted criminals to successfully re-enter the workforce. Do you have any knowledge on that, Kysten?
In 2015, 16, anywhere between the years of 2014 and 2016, where the whole criminal justice reform effort became bipartisan. The Koch brothers were in Ohio, and they helped craft some of the language and some of the and carried some of the lobbying for the CQE. But since CQE has been adopted as legislation, we have not heard much from the Koch brothers or the Koch Institute.
Thanks, Kysten. I do want to ask, we're winding down here on the hour. This is a Baldwin Wallace event, and I want to ask you for faculty, for staff, there's some students on the call today as well. what are the most important actions that we can take realistically at where we're at now to fight for equality, to fight for justice in our nation? There's obviously so much to be done. I know you joke about having a long-winded answer. I'm sure you could go on for far longer in explaining these things, and I'm sure there's a lot of detail that we just don't have time to get into today. But where do we start, and what can we do right here on Baldwin Wallace's campus or in the surrounding communities?
So we talk about students who are interested in working in this field, or are we just talking about becoming involved?
Mostly becoming involved, but also if you want to touch on too, becoming involved in the work that you do, it might be interesting. I know we have at least one student today that is thinking about going into a similar line of work that you're in.
Okay. Well, on college campuses, I would say, understand both sides of the fight. You can't pivot or anticipate policy changes that counteract your fight if you don't know or understand the opposition's positions, beliefs, and thought process. I would say lead with passion and not with emotion, because passion will fuel you to keep going after setbacks and letdowns. Emotions can take a toll on your soul, physically and mentally. And because this is a hard fight, it's not going to be won overnight. And as you can see, what is playing out on the stage right now. So it's a long, protracted fight. So lead with passion, because passion will fuel you. Organize voter registration drives, at the time, I would have said complete the census. But in a decade later, complete your census. Educate your fellow students in your class when discussions of policy, laws, and legislation are introduced without consideration of the negative impact on people of color, gender, LGBTQIA. Fight for equity means more than equality. Equality means that we all have a seat at the table. Equity means that we all have a seat at the table to make us whole. So if the table is too high for individuals to sit at eye to eye with everyone, we have to find a chair that raises them up to the same level to the table to achieve the same eye level as everyone at the table. And the table is around to be inclusive, so no one is sitting at the head or at the end. And whenever you see inequity, speak up, speak out, speak loud, speak consistently for change, because injustice persists when good people remain silent and do nothing. And if you're not a person of color or LGBTQIA plus or male or female, and if you're not within that population you want to assist, ask those individuals how you can be helpful in the fight. Don't assume that you know what they need. Inequity and injustice is a disease of this nation. And if we were the doctor, you would not treat your patient without first having a conversation about your patient's medical needs. And finally, in the words of the great Representative John Lewis, get in good trouble and necessary trouble. And so if I would just talk to students about how they could be interested in the work to fight this, I would say read and study American history, understand the political process, read and study the history of racial injustice in this country. And I've given Christy a litany of books and podcasts to as a reference. Read and study and understand the intersectionality of race, poverty, and criminal justice system, particularly how we as a nation have used incarceration as a way to deal or not deal with social problems, and understand the origins and the history of the criminal justice system, particularly as it relates to incarceration. Understand the civic process and study political science. Understand how to build the framework of a policy, from policy formation to implementation, and absolutely know and understand the Constitution of the United States. So I also suggest following to read. Read the Declaration of Independence. Understand and read the Emancipation Proclamation, the Articles of Confederation, Common Sense by Thomas Paine, and the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Seek out internships or volunteer opportunities. Seek out opportunities to shadow individuals working in the fields to get a feel for operations, and seek out individuals working in the fields that to have conversations with COVID, it's pretty easy to schedule a Zoom call. So it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go to the people. You could also have conversations. You could have coffee chats. And then I would say also start reading the criminal justice systems in other countries to get a feel for what could be, how we could reimagine the criminal justice system. And so that we are truly working on rehabilitation and not just corrections. And I would say also, it's not our differences that divide us. It's our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. And that's a quote from Audre Lorde.
Well, Kysten, we can tell that you're well read, and I think everybody's going to be able to tell even more when they see as you said, your litany of book recommendations. And when I first met Kysten, she pulled a couple of those books off her bookshelf. They are not thin, so I hope you have some time over the holiday break. I do want to ask also, Kysten, with keeping in mind the holidays, and you mentioned being able to understand both sides of an issue. One thing that we're trying to do as part of Unite for Justice, the organization that I co-founded in conjunction with the Brain Center on Baldwin Wallace campus, is how to have conversations with individuals that we don't necessarily agree with. These are obviously very difficult topics. When people disagree, it tends to get emotional, it tends to get heated. People worry about damaging those relationships, and a lot of times because of that, they don't want to talk about these issues if they know the other person disagrees. Do you have any advice for anyone in our audience today, when they go to Thanksgiving, when they go to Christmas dinner, how should they try to engage with people that do not see them eye to eye? Are there best practices, things that we can do better?
Well, one of the things that I suggest is, be patient. I think, and be an active listener. I think one of the things that we do is that we listen for things that we can go, but this, right? And be patient, listen intently and actively, and understand that, hey, find out why they feel the way that they feel, right? And then, and I know when you're talking about trying to get your viewpoint across, we're yelling, and sometimes we want to be the loudest voice in the room, and we always think that the loudest voice in the room is the one that is most passionate and has the most intelligent argument, but it's not. And always make sure that you double and triple check your facts when you're talking to folks. When you're at the family dinners, you can just say, hey, I understand that you are passionate about X, Y, and Z, but here are the effects that are the ripple effects in the current. And if we don't figure out a way which we can come together, there are more commonalities than differences. And it is true. And that conversations are going to be uncomfortable. And sometimes you just have to say, what I'm going to say is historical fact. And when we have to separate the fiction from the fact. And we have to separate what we believe to be true from what is actually true. And it's really difficult when we're talking about race, because much of our country's historical fact has been buried. The fact that we are now on the precipice of burying the 1916 project for a 1776 project, that will probably be sanitized. But I said, bring on the 1776 as well, because in that, it's still a history of oppression. We've had that history, and until we have a truth and reconciliation, we will continue to have this. And we have to be patient. And we have to be able to say, I hear you, I understand that, but this is what those policies have done, ... Always data. If you're a data geek, and I mean that with all sincerity, because I'm a data geek, because data tells the story, use data and facts. But sometimes people are so entrenched And sometimes you have to get to a point where you're like, okay, you're going to believe what you believe, and I'm going to stick what I believe. But that doesn't mean I'm going to not like you because you believe this way, right? So we're going to have to figure out a way in which we can have peace, we can have love, and I can still love you even though I disagree with you, and we have to agree to disagree. But in the end, we have history and fact. We have 400 years of history and fact, and you can drive people around in your local neighborhoods to show some of the devastation. And I know that this is always an issue. There are, I would suggest that if you have an opportunity, if you can go with the Catherine T. Foundation, MacArthur Foundation, they have a lot of engagement opportunities. And the pretrial justice, they're having engagement opportunities and talking about how to have that uncomfortable conversation about race, how to have a truth reckoning and reconciliation conversation. So I suggest those opportunities as well.
Kysten, thank you so much. I want to be mindful of people's time. I know we have some 4 p.m. meetings, and I want to be mindful of the fact too that I know everybody's getting more and more zoomed out as the semester goes on, as we get deeper and deeper into this remote world that we're living in. You gave us a tremendous wealth of knowledge. This will be recorded in case anybody wasn't able to absorb all of it during this hour. I just want to say thank you, Kysten. This was great. We will share the book list that Kysten shared with Christy. We'll share that with everyone. Is there any closing remarks that you have, Kysten? Anything that I didn't ask you that you want to touch upon real quick in the last 2 minutes that we have?
So I just want people to know that when we're talking about equity and justice, that my freedom is intricately tied to the freedom of other individuals. It's intricately tied to the freedom and equity of Julie, and it's equally tied to the equity and freedom of Christy, and everyone on this. So injustice for one is injustice for all. And so if we come from that aspect, right? So I'm not just fighting for equity and freedom and justice for Black and brown people, but for my Asian brothers and sisters who were viciously maligned when COVID first happened, my LGBTQI brothers and sisters. So we have to realize that our existence on this planet is intricately connected to one another, and we cannot be divided, else we will be, a house divided will be imploded from in. We keep looking for outsides and terrorists, we will implode ourselves if we don't come together and find ways to love one another and begin to have conversations and respect one another for our differences, as well as our commonalities. We can't always look for that, but we have to respect one another. So that's.
Well, thank you, Kysten. I think that's a great way to wrap it up. You've given us plenty to think about, and I think that just gives us one more thing to think about as we continue with our week. And again, I just want to thank everyone for taking an hour to come spend with us and learn a little bit more about the criminal justice system. Listen to Kysten and how brilliant she is. It's been great. It's been awesome to interview you, and thank you. I kicked Christy out of her office, so thank you, Christy, for helping with the tech issues that BW's been experiencing today, and for everyone being flexible. Julie does have some closing remarks, so I'll let Julie jump in real quick. If people do have to go, we do understand, but I'll let Julie take it over.
I have about 20 seconds. Just want to say thank you so much, Kysten. Inspiring talk. You've given us so much to think about, to unpack, so much. When you mentioned an 11-year-old child in the system, and my son turns 11 next week, like that brings it home for me, right? And the hurt people. That's a powerful thing, and it's so true. But thank you. And thanks to Nick for asking some great questions and moderating. Thanks to all of our attendees. If you have suggestions for topics or stories to share, please speak with us. We would love to hear what you would like to hear next semester. Thanks, everyone. Have a fabulous rest of your day.
Thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it. It's an honor. Thank you.